When it comes to the histories of elves and men and hobbits, Tolkien gave us loads of information to work with. But when it comes to the dwarves, much of their Third Age history is lost to us. But not all of it is. Alla Tulia Meldonia Aharamariese. My name is Rainbow Dave, and welcome to another Tolkien lore video. So, for most of the Third Age, dwarves fought orcs. In fact, that sentence pretty much sums up a good chunk of all dwarven history. And this was the way it had always been for countless generations. But for 6 years in the third millennium, these generations of conflict erupted into an official and full-blown war between the two races. And I would argue that despite its lack of focus in the Great Tales, this war of the dwarves and the orcs went on to affect the eventual fate of Middle-earth. Now, if you've seen the Hobbit movies, then this story will not be entirely new information. But there's a lot more to the conflict than the movies show us, and there's a lot of things that they change. So, without wanting to throw too much shade at the Hobbit movies, let's untangle the true nature of this legendary war between the dwarves and the orcs. So, when I said that this war lasted 6 years, that was a little bit misleading. You see, there were 6 years between the official declaration of war and the climactic battle, but the prelude to all of this goes back to the very beginning of the dwarven race. And I'd argue that its aftermath extends all the way to the War of the Ring and the eventual defeat of Sauron. So, perhaps we might consider that the War of the Dwarves and Orcs was just 6 years in a conflict that really spans almost all of dwarven history. So, if we're going to start right at the very, very beginning, then I guess the whole thing begins way back before even the First Age, with the awakening of Durin the Deathless, aka the first dwarf ever. Now, Durin the Deathless awoke in the mountain of Gundabad, which went on to become a revered and holy site amongst the dwarves for that very reason. And Durin also earned his epithet of the Deathless, and he did so by living at least 2,395 years, which for a dwarf is mind-blowing. And among Durin's other claims to fame are that he was the founding father of the Longbeard clan, who are also known as Durin's folk. And these guys account for pretty much every single named dwarf in the Legendarium. Well, except Azog, and Telkar, and Keem and Meem. But outside of the Silmarillion, every named dwarf is one of Durin's folk. And Durin is also the founder of Khazad-dûm. And it was prophesied that Durin the Deathless would be reincarnated 7 times before the dwarven race eventually departs the world. Although whether this is a literal reincarnation or more metaphorical is a matter of debate. So it is fair to say that Durin the Deathless is a pretty legendary figure within dwarven mythology. And as an extension of Durin's legacy, both Mount Gundabad and Khazad-dûm were revered places also. So the reason that all this is significant is that by the time the War of the Dwarves and Orcs bubbled into existence in the Third Age, both Khazad-dûm and Mount Gundabad had been taken from the dwarves by their enemies. Thousands of years ago in the Second Age, Sauron ordered his orcs to conquer the holy mountain of Gundabad and to turn it into an orc stronghold, which they did. And 800 years before the start of this War of the Dwarves and Orcs, a Balrog awoke in Khazad-dûm. It killed King Durin VI, and Moria was swiftly abandoned. So, just like the holy mountain of Gundabad, the revered city of Durin the Deathless also became an orc-infested pit. Now, this was all obviously bad news for the dwarves of Durin's folk, but things were destined to get a lot worse before they eventually reached their breaking point. So, without Khazad-dûm or Gundabad, Durin's folk established new kingdoms in the north, chiefly the exiled kingdom of the Grey Mountains, which is where many of the refugees of Moria fled to. And for a little while, things were okay for these exiled dwarves. But then came the dragons. So, I guess one could argue that the War of the Dwarves and Orcs began right as the War of the Dwarves and Dragons came to a close. You see, the dragons were an absolutely devastating enemy for the dwarves, and their war ended in absolute ruin. The Grey Mountains that I just mentioned, they fell to the cold drakes of the north, and the king of the Grey Mountains was slain. Now, this king had 2 surviving sons. The younger son was called Gror, and he established another exiled kingdom in the Iron Hills, which will become important in just a little bit. And the other brother, who was called Thror, took the Arkenstone and re-established the kingdom of Erebor, and he is the old guy that we meet at the beginning of the Hobbit movie, the grandfather of Thorin. Now, you probably don't need me to tell you this, because it wasn't long before Erebor faced a dragon of its own. And the dragon fire of Smaug obliterated the dwarven kingdom under the mountain. So, 23 years before the official outbreak of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, Durin's folk were once again made homeless, and those who didn't flee to the Iron Hills were forced to wander south as refugees, and they went into the foreign lands of Dunland, which, by the way, that's where Rohan's enemies, the wild men of Dunland, live. Now, it is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's worth mentioning that despite the movies portraying Thorin as barely having aged throughout all these flashbacks, he was only 24 when Smaug sacked Erebor, which by dwarven standards is very, very young. And I think this is significant to his character because by the time of The Hobbit, Thorin is 195 years old, which means he'd spent 171 years as a refugee. He was a prince and a king without a kingdom. All he had of Erebor were childhood memories from a lifetime ago. Anyway, this is where things begin to heat up, because as you can probably imagine, King Thror was not happy about the multiple losses of his ancestral homelands, and he began to sink into a deep depression, which certainly wasn't helped by the last of the dwarven rings that he still wore on his finger. So, just 3 years before the official outbreak of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, Thror left his people, his ring, and the key to Erebor in Dunland with his son Thrain. And Thror set off with only one companion on a great pilgrimage to the great gates of Durin the Deathless, which is the original entrance to the city of Khazad-dûm. Now, Thror and his companion, whose name was Nar, did successfully make it to the other side of the Misty Mountains, and eventually they arrived in the Dimril Dale. Before them was Lake Mirrormere, which is where Durin the Deathless had beheld the vision that inspired him to found Khazad-dûm in the first place. And beside the water's edge was the ancient Durin Stone, which marked the spot where the first dwarf had stood when he received this vision. So I imagine that from Thror's perspective, this must have been a bit like the culmination of a holy pilgrimage. Being the king of Durin's folk, Thror decreed that Khazad-dûm was his by right, and that he was its air. And furthermore, the great gates were open. So surely this was a sign that the time had come for Durin's folk to reclaim Khazad-dûm. Well, at least that's how Thror saw it. However, his companion Nar was a lot more cautious. So Nar begged Thror to be aware of the dangers and not to enter Moria alone. But Thror was a king, and he refused to live without a kingdom for any longer. So, Thror passed through the Great Gate alone, and Nar awaited his return from the outside. But Thror never did come back. You see, inside Moria dwelt the infamous orc Azog. And I'm afraid there aren't too many details given about Azog other than his name, like we don't know his age or his purpose in Moria, but it's very possible that Azog was a chieftain of those orcs sent by Sauron to populate Moria 310 years earlier. However, what we do know for certain is that he was one of the highest ranking orcs in the north. And we also know that as far as the orcs were concerned, he was the king of Moria. So after an unknown number of days waiting outside for his king, Nar eventually beheld a harrowing sight. King Thror's headless body was flung out of the great gates, and his severed head immediately followed. Upon inspection, Nar found that branded into Thror's forehead in Cirith runes was the word Azog. And a moment later, Nar was struck by a purse containing what Tolkien tells us was a few coins of little worth. Now, this purse was thrown by Azog himself, and he allowed Nar to live simply so that he could pass on the message to the rest of Durin's folk. The implication of this macabre payment was clear. Azog would permit no future beggars to enter his kingdom, and he'd allow no others to declare themselves Moria's king. Now, after thousands of years of ancestral conflict, this, the murder of King Thror by the chieftain Azog, was the spark that ultimately ignited the dwarves and the orcs into full-blown war. You see, when Thror's son Thrain eventually learned from Nar what had happened to his father, he sat in silent contemplation for 7 days, refusing to eat or to sleep. But finally, on the 7th day, Thrain arose from his throne, and he declared, "This cannot be borne." And for the next 3 years, Thrain amassed what is probably the greatest dwarven army ever assembled in Middle-earth's history. So Tolkien tells us that Thrain's host was joined by great forces sent from the houses of other fathers, for this dishonour filled them with wrath. And this is an interesting detail, because it implies that not only was Thrain's army of Durin's folk bolstered by Broadbeams and Firebeards of the West, but also potentially by the super mysterious dwarves of the East. And when the dwarven host was fully mustered, the great war of the dwarves and the orcs was ready to begin. Now, despite the length of this video, I'm afraid there's not a huge amount to say about the specific battles in this war. You see, it almost entirely happened underground after all, and so there were no elven or mannish chroniclers who ever truly learned the details of what happened, and so it's not really recorded in any of Tolkien's writings. But what we can infer is that the dwarves began in the north, and it seems that they systematically worked their way south, cleansing the Misty Mountains as they went. And it seems that the first site that the dwarves reclaimed was the first one that they'd lost. So, 4,537 years after Mount Gundabad was first sacked and populated by Sauron's orcs in the Second Age, the dwarves of King Thrain finally reconquered the Holy Mountain. And I can only imagine the orcs inside were slaughtered. Over the next 6 years, the dwarven army moved south, through the Misty Mountains, winning battle after battle through their strength and their matchless weapons and the fire of their anger, until they finally arrived in the Dimril Dale, the very same place where Durin the Deathless had begun the founding of Khazad-dûm, and the very same place where Thror's severed head had been cast out by Azog. Now, in the Khuzdul language of the dwarves, the Dimril Dale is known as Azanulbizar, and this was the name that was given to the epic battle that's fought here. So, the Battle of Azanulbizar is that same battle that we see briefly in the first Hobbit movie, although Tolkien's telling of it differs significantly from Peter Jackson's. I mean, to be fair, it is in this battle that a young Thorin, he was only 54 at the time, used an oak branch as his shield and thus took up the epithet Oakenshield, which the movie does get right, but as we know, Thror was already dead when this battle started. Also, Thrain was blinded in one eye during the fighting, and perhaps the most significant change is the fate of Azog. Now, obviously in the movie, he gets his arm cut off by Thorin and he lives to fight another day, but in Tolkien's writings, this is completely different. It's not even Thorin who Azog fights. Because, remember earlier when I mentioned Thror's brother Gror founding a kingdom in the Iron Hills after the War of the Dwarves and Dragons, and I said that these dwarves would be important later? Well, it's in this battle that we're going to see why. So, just as Thror has a grandson called Thorin, Gror has a grandson called Dain Ironfoot. And Dain is possibly my number one favourite dwarf in the entire Legendarium. He is utterly badass. So, Dain Ironfoot, alongside his father Nain and the rest of the dwarves from the Iron Hills, fought at Azanulbizar. And just like his cousin Thorin, Dain achieved massive fame and acclaim in this battle. Now, the dwarves of the Iron Hills arrived late, and before they showed up, it looked like the orcs might actually be victorious. But when these dwarves did finally arrive, they brought with them fresh reinforcements that turned the tide of battle. In fact, Dain's father, Nain, even fought his way all the way up to the Great Gate of Moria, and he demanded that Azog come out to fight him. Now, we're told that before this point in the battle, Azog hadn't yet emerged from Moria to risk his own life. But when Nain challenged him, he perceived that his time had come. So, Azog emerged from the darkness and he fought a one-on-one duel with Nain. Now, I gotta say, Nain was a great warrior, and we can presume that he was a veteran of many dwarven battles in the past. But when he faced Azog at Azanulbizar, he was half blinded by rage. Now, we're told that Nain swung at Azog with all his might, but the orc was nimble, and when Nain missed, his weapon shattered on the rocks, and Azog broke his neck. The king's cousin died instantly. However, despite Azog's personal victory, his orc army was routed and his guards were dead. So, like a bit of a coward, Azog turned towards the gate and he tried to flee back inside Moria. But that did not turn out the way he had hoped. You see, Dain Ironfoot had just watched his father die at Azog's hand, and so he had no intention of letting the orc escape to fight another day. So, Dain charged at Azog, and outside the gates of Moria, he hewed the orc's head from his shoulders with his red axe. Now, what's particularly nuts about all of this is that Dain Ironfoot was only 32 at the time, which I guess may not sound especially young, but by dwarven standards, it really was. You know, for comparison's sake, we're told that during the events of The Hobbit, Gimli, the dwarf, was too young to take part in the quest of Erebor. He was, after all, 15 years younger than their youngest member, Kili. But Gimli was 62 during the events of The Hobbit. So, despite being supposedly too young for adventure, he was almost double the age of Dain Ironfoot when Dain killed Azog at Azanulbizar, which makes Dain an insanely awesome dwarven prodigy. But anyway, after the Battle of Azanulbizar and after the death of Azog, the War of the Dwarves and Orcs was declared over. Azog's severed head was impaled on a spike, and the same purse containing a few coins of little worth was stuffed into his mouth. King Thror was finally avenged. But the victory had come at a high cost. Although we're told that 10,000 orcs had been killed in the battle, the dwarven dead were beyond the count of grief. And although King Thrain sought to press his advantage and reclaim Moria once and for all, he was dissuaded by his nephew, Dain Ironfoot. You see, whilst killing Azog, Dain alone had looked into Moria, and he had seen the shadow of Durin's bane. In fact, it was Dain who prophesied to the king that some other power than ours must come before Durin's folk walk again in Moria. Now, on the one hand, it would seem that this marks the end of the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. However, I would argue that although Azog's death begins a 142-year ceasefire, the conflict was not yet truly over. Because, of course, Azog is the only orc in the entire Legendarium who we are explicitly told has a son. And this son is another orc chieftain called Bolg. And Bolg would meet both Thorin and Dain one more time before the very end. So, if we skip forward like a century and a half from the Battle of Azanulbizar, Thrain's son Thorin Oakenshield will lead his company to reclaim his grandfather's kingdom of Erebor from Smaug the dragon. And that's pretty much the plot of The Hobbit. But of course, once Erebor is reclaimed and the dragon is dead, there's one more battle that needs to be fought. And in this battle of the 5 armies, Thorin and Bolg lead their respective forces once again into war. And once again, Dain Ironfoot is there. And once again, Dain Ironfoot watches a family member die in battle. So, with the eventual deaths of Thorin and Fili and Kili, the line of Thror is finally wiped out. But with the death of Bolg, so too is the line of Azog wiped out. And it would appear that with this, the War of the Dwarves and Orcs is finally ended. But I would still argue that there is one last epilogue which brings this war full circle. Because, to be honest, upon reflection, this does not seem like a particularly happy ending. I mean, Erebor once again belongs to the dwarves, and Dain Ironfoot has taken his cousin's place as the king, but Moria is still an orc stronghold, and at some point between the Battle of Azanulbizar and the Hobbit, orcs once again reclaim the holy mountain of Gundabad. The dwarves may have won a Pyrrhic victory, but it came at a heavy cost. And there's one more victory that needs to be won. There's one more heavy price that needs to be paid. You see, in the year 3019, in fact only 2 days after the much more famous Battle of Pelennor Fields, Erebor once again came under attack. However, this time it wasn't a vengeful faction of Misty Mountain orcs or a fire-breathing dragon that declared war on the dwarves. This time it was an army of Sauron's Easterlings. And for King Dane Ironfoot, who was now 252 years old, this would be the final time that he ever rode out to war. So, alongside the men of Dale, the dwarves of Erebor fought one more great battle, and they died for one more Pyrrhic victory. You see, King Dane was joined upon the battlefield by King Brand of Dale. That's the grandson of Bard the Bowman. And for 3 days they fought together against the servants of Sauron. However, by the 3rd day, the Easterlings were gaining the upper hand, and the union of dwarves and men were forced to retreat towards the doors of Erebor. There, Brand and Dane fought valiantly, but in the end, King Brand was slain. The dwarves and the men of Dale retreated into the mountain where they were besieged, but Dane did not retreat with them. Just as his nephews Fili and Kili had died defending Thorin's body 77 years earlier, Dane too stayed to protect the body of his fellow King Brand. And outside the doors of his own kingdom, Dane Ironfoot was slain. But it was not in vain. After 8 days of battle, something incredible happened. Thousands of miles away from Erebor, all the way in the south, the One Ring was finally destroyed. Sauron was finally defeated. Now, to be honest, it did take another 2 days for the Easterlings to eventually be driven off, but in the end, it was King Brand's son, Bard II, along with King Dane's son, whose name was Thorin III, who led their people out of Erebor, and the 2 kings expelled the Easterlings from Dale for good. Now, the Battle of Dale may at first seem like little more than a footnote when compared to the much more famous Battle of Pelennor Fields, but it shouldn't be disregarded as such. Gandalf himself actually states, "When you think of the great battle of the Pelennor, do not forget the battles in Dale, and the valour of Durin's folk." We're told that if Dane and Brand had failed to hold back the Easterlings in the north, then the scales would have tipped in Mordor's favour. The servants of Sauron would have joined with his forces at Dol Guldur, and regardless of the victory at Pelennor Fields, the armies of the West would have been overrun and crushed. Gandalf would have been unable to draw out Sauron's army at the Black Gate, and so it's doubtful that Frodo and Sam would have even made it to Mount Doom. I feel like it's very easy to think of dwarven history as being utterly separate from the histories of the elves and men. After all, for most of the Second and Third Ages, they dwelt underground, and they kept out of the proverbial spotlight. There is no dwarven equivalent of the Silmarillion, and most of the details of dwarven lives are lost to us. But in spite of that, I don't think that dwarven history is separate at all. If not for the dwarves of Durin's folk, it's highly likely that Sauron would have won, and Middle-earth would have fallen into darkness. Tolkien tells us if not for Durin's folk, there would be no queen in Gondor. There would be only ruin and ash. But over the centuries, tens of thousands of dwarves laid down their lives because they believed that orcs could not win. They believed that there was something good beneath the mountains and that it was theirs. And in the end, their sacrifice paid off. At some unknown date in the Fourth Age, Durin the Deathless was reincarnated for the seventh and final time. Under his kingship, we're told that the dwarves reclaimed Khazad-dûm, and they prospered in their kingdoms beneath the earth, until the world grew old, and the days of Durin's race ended. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this video interesting. If you have any thoughts or questions or comments about the dwarves, then go ahead and share them in the comment section below. And if you did enjoy this video, be sure to check out some of the others on the channel. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love, stay groovy, and Navaya Melanine.